Okay, for our next panel, we're going to hear from the perspectives of the MIT faculty. So we've actually assembled a pretty distinguished group. I'm going to start off and introduce the moderator, who is Ian Hutchinson. So Ian, you recognize from his accent, got most of his formal education in other countries in the US, but he did eventually come to MIT to establish and then operate MIT's tokamak fusion reactor. He then served as the chair of the Nuclear Science and Engineering Department. Since then, he has gone Emeritus and is with all the honor that goes with that, and is one of the founding co-presidents of the MIT faculty MIT Council on Academic Freedom. So glad to have you here, Ian, and please introduce your wonderful panel.
Thank you, Wayne, for this opportunity. I'm just going to introduce the panel, and then they're going to have very brief 3-minute statements, sort of opening statements to help you understand where they're coming from, and then we'll go into questions, and I'll try to leave plenty of time at the end for audience questions. Let me introduce Professor Peko Hosoi, is Pappalardo Professor of Mechanical Engineering and Professor of Mathematics at MIT. Her research lies in the junction of fluid dynamics, biomechanics, bio-inspired design, and sports. She was the co-chair of CAFC, the Council on Academic Freedom and Campus Expression, which is the formal committee of academic freedom discussion at MIT. And she's also served as the Associate Dean of the MIT School of Engineering and the Associate Chair of the faculty. Roger Levy is Professor of Brain and Cognitive Sciences at MIT and is the current chair of the faculty. His research program lies in the cognitive science of language at the intersection of artificial intelligence, linguistics, and psychology. He previously chaired MIT's Committee on the Library System for 5 years and was president of, in 24-25, of the Cognitive Science Society. And Daniel Jackson is professor of computer science and associate director of CSAIL. And his research is about improving the design of software. And his book, The Essence of Software, offers a new way to think about software functionality. He's also a photographer, collected stories and portraits of students, faculty, and staff experiencing mental health challenges in his book, Portraits of Resilience. And so I'll invite each of them to give their opening 3-minute statement. I'm going to police this fiercely. Roger, you're first.
Okay, great. I'll turn on my stopwatch here. Great. First of all, I want to thank Ian and all of you. Ian, thank you for organizing this event, and to all of you for joining. And I'm really excited to hear what my fellow panelists have to say and to hear questions and for the discussion. I'm going to just start actually by explaining my role as the chair of the faculty, because I think as an alumnus, you may not have been in a position to know that much about it, and this is also relevant for some of Peko's experience. So this is, and I want to start by talking briefly about the standards for how shared governance works at US universities and about how it works in particular at MIT. So I think it's safe to say that the broadly shared standard for shared governance across US universities, and this goes back a century at least, is there's a board of trustees in the case of MIT, the MIT Corporation. There's the administration, headed by a president or a chancellor, sometimes it's called at MIT, obviously. It's the president, and then there is the faculty. And there's a delineation of sort of responsibilities between those three parts of the triangle, so to speak. And when shared governance works well, those different three parts are working together well. There's good communication, and there's good decision-making at the institution. So with the faculty role, part of that role is primary responsibility for fundamental areas like curriculum, instruction, research, faculty status, and also aspects of life that pertain to the educational process. Now, how exactly that looks varies from university to university, but I think it's safe to say that MIT largely follows that model. Faculty governance includes 11 standing committees of the faculty covering academic programs, curricula, student discipline, academic performance, some student discipline, and also other input into other matters that pertain to campus life. For example, student life and to some extent campus planning. And these are primarily elected. So this is elected representation from the faculty by the faculty for the most part. And then we also have 3 faculty officers, the chair of the faculty, 2 associate chairs. Peko served as one of the 2 associate chairs in the term preceding the one that I've just started. And the role of the faculty officers is to lead faculty governance and also to interact regularly with the administration and also with the corporation to represent faculty voices. And how do we know how to do that? We represent faculty voices through listening to the faculty. And so I will say that, and I think there's an opportunity for me to say a little bit more about this. Sure. And one of the questions that Ian's going to ask me or may ask me. But I want to just firmly emphasize that my approach in the next 2 years, these are 2-year terms, to promoting free expression at MIT is firmly grounded in an understanding of that role and how it is that I can understand, hear, listen to, and represent the faculty effectively in those fora. And it's really a delight also to hear from alumni as well, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your perspective. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Daniel, would you like to go next, please?
Sure, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much, Ian, for inviting me, and it's great to be here with my colleagues. I think it's a very interesting time. I have to admit, I've been a member of MITCAF, the organization that Ian and his colleagues founded, and I'm very grateful for it. But I have to admit, perhaps this won't go down well here. I did think that free speech was not the fundamental issue that we faced. I thought it was certainly a very important issue. But I think the events of the last couple of years have changed all of that. And I think we're really in an unprecedented situation where we have a degree of polarization that is quite extraordinary. Our students, I think, come into the university already pressured and in some ways sort of classified and categorized in terms of their views. And I think that the wider world is not providing a model for civilized and for civil debate and constructive difference. So I think, and that of course combined with the fact that we're now perhaps I won't compare to historical precedents, but I'll say we are certainly, as I think we know, receiving extraordinary external pressure that is compromising our right to free speech on campus. And I think we feel that even at MIT, and I think that's an enormous problem. One of the things I will say is that even in our email exchanges on our listserv, which are very freewheeling and open amongst faculty members and generally very, very civil and constructive, I will say, I even feel a reluctance sometimes to express my true point of view not because of my colleagues, but because of the general political atmosphere we're in now. And I think that I'm sort of shocked. It was a realization, in responding to a message just last week that I realized that I felt that probably for the first time in my life, and I think that's extremely disturbing. I will say that while I think that free speech and standing up for free speech are absolutely essential, and that as the faculty, we need to do that, and we need to push back on some of the quite shocking perceptions that many people have about the role of free speech, and in particular, recently, the acceptability of violence as a way of suppressing free speech. There's a letter that was just published by a subset of the members of MITCAF expressing horror at the murder of Charlie Kirk and at the idea that violence is an appropriate way to control speech. At the same time, I feel that our role as faculty is not so much to litigate or to advocate for particular philosophical perspectives on free speech, but to model for our students what it means to have truly civilized engagement with each other. And I do think that that is our primary role as an educational institute. And I think that we are We are certainly all committed to that, and we're doing our best in that respect, but I think it's something that I hope we'll be able to expand in the coming years.
Thank you very much. Peko?
Yeah, I won't take my full 3 minutes because we're going to get to much more interesting conversation after this. First, related to my introduction, if anybody would like to talk to me about sports afterwards, I'm happy to talk about that as well. So in this panel, I'm going to be wearing my hat as one of the co-chairs of CAFC, the Committee on Academic Freedom and Campus Expression, which has been underway for about a year and a half, but we're about to disband and make some recommendations. So I'll talk a little bit about that. And also my experience as the associate chair of the faculty. So as the associate chair of the faculty over the last 2 years, basically when the faculty have something to complain about, they come to me or the chair of the faculty. And so I've seen and heard many things that have happened on campus, which I think run sort of over a broad spectrum of things that are acceptable and things that are not acceptable. And so I think I can bring that kind of perspective to this discussion. I also just, in response to some of the things that both Daniel and Roger have said, to Daniel's point where, when I think about my own personal experience, I don't feel like I'm censoring myself because of my colleagues. I feel like I can talk to my colleagues. But I have gotten multiple emails from MIT lawyers saying, do not delete these emails because they may be subpoenaed. Right? And when you're in that kind of an atmosphere, there are things that you're not going to put on the listservs, and you're not going to engage in those discussions. I think part of that, I think one of the things that I've encountered both in CAFC and in my role as associate chair is that the dialogues that we have online are not the same as the dialogues we have in person. And sort of the cultural norms online are not the same as the cultural norms in person. And I think that's something that we have to grapple with when we start to figure out what is the culture that we would like to be on campus around free speech. So I'll pause there because I know we have many other things to get to.
Great, thank you all three very much. I want to begin by following up on with you, Peko, and ask you to explain a little bit more what you think CAFC's mission or job is or was, and what the future might hold in this space.
Yeah, perfect. So CAFC, we were charged about a year and a half or 2 years ago.
Closer to 2, I think.
Closer to 2, probably. The charge, so the primary thing in the charge was to implement or develop a roadmap to implement the recommendations that came from FUGE, which was the Freedom of Expression Working Group. So there were about 10 recommendations in that document, which is available online. If you go to cafc.mit.edu, there's a link to those recommendations. So when my co-chair Mike Sipser and I took the job, we assumed that was what we were going to be working from. In addition, there were a couple of things that were just sort of put on in the charge as add-ons, right? So the add-ons were things like advise the administration on where free speech abuts MIT policies and procedures, or serve as a campus resource to advise people on matters around free speech. So we thought, okay, fine, we can do that. That's probably not going to be the main part of our charge. And then October 7th happened. And then everything was on fire. So what we ended up doing, I would say very little of our time was actually spent on looking at the recommendations from the Freedom of Expression Working Group, because we had so many people coming to us with just trying to understand how to navigate these waters. And one of the things that I think was most useful and most eye-opening for me in CAFC is that there aren't resources to understand how things are being adjudicated across campus in this space, right? So if I'm a PI, I'm in a lab, my postdoc has put something that somebody else in my lab has complained about on his Instagram account. As a PI, that's the only example I see. Whereas if we have something like CAFC, which is a working group, I might have seen that one PI might come to me, the libraries might come to me, somebody in a different department might come to me. So we see kind of the overarching kind of spectrum of issues that people are dealing with, and so we can provide some context. And without doing that, people are trying to address these issues without having any context, which is very, very difficult. So I think that's one of the things that we found, despite our charge, which had a bunch of very, very sort of ambitious things. I think serving as that resource to give some consistency across campus was probably the most useful thing we did.
Are you comfortable or happy with the experience? I mean,
I'm not quite sure what comfortable or happy means in this context. I think that, so first I will say, I think the committee was phenomenal. And I think the two best members we had were the two graduate students, which were Angie Jo and AJ Miller. And they were so even-keeled, so objective. They were so good at keeping the view that our main job was freedom of expression, even though people were coming at us with all different kinds of complaints, and so good at articulating the student viewpoint and how the students would perceive different policies and procedures. That I think most of the great things that came out of the committee was because of the input from those two.
okay. Any other comments from panel? Okay.
I'll just briefly add, so one thing I'll say about my role as the chair of the faculty is that it's preceded by a year as chair-elect. And during the past year, part of that work involves meeting with the faculty officers at the time. So I was actually meeting regularly on a weekly basis with Peko, along with the other associate chair, Ellie Nadivi, and the past chair, Mary Fuller. And CAFC material, Peko regularly brought more actually the approach that they were taking to CAFC and dealing with the issues that it was confronted with. And I was just extraordinarily impressed. Really a lot of very innovative and thoughtful ways of, for example, gauging, you take a particular scenario, like a hypothetical scenario. Sometimes it might not have been a hypothetical scenario, but you don't know, because not all scenarios are widely publicized that happen. And then you just feel out what the members of the committee, how do they see that situation? How do they see that scenario? And that's an incredibly interesting and effective way, I think, of gauging really both where sentiment lies and also surfacing perspectives that one might not have recognized before. So I'll just say I've been thoroughly impressed with the work of CAFC, and I'll also say that I'm going to be on the receiving end of the recommendations.
Absolutely.
So I'm really intensely interested in
Yes.
where they wind up landing. So
Actually, but let me give. I can even be more specific on this about how we did this. So one of the things that we charged was looking at the revised poster policy, which I have many opinions on the revised poster policy. But let's just say that the committee was charged to look at the poster policy. And what we decided to do is we said, we're just going to walk around MIT and take a picture of all the posters that are on the walls. So we took a picture of one, and then we made a poll for the committee. And we said, if you read the poster policy, do you think this poster would be allowed? Yes, no, maybe. I can't tell from reading the policy. B, do you think this poster should be allowed in reading the policy? And you get a lot of, from what you get out of it is you understand where is the policy clear. Right? Yes, everybody can tell this is allowed or not allowed. Where's the policy unclear? And where is the policy not aligned with what the faculty think or what that committee thinks should be allowed? And that actually revealed a lot of really interesting things.
Thanks so much. Roger, what do you think the faculty chair's contribution to free speech should be?
Great. This is a great question. I'm going to widen it from free speech to free expression more broadly. Okay. I actually think the role of the faculty chair, of the chair of the faculty and of the faculty officers, the single most important thing to do is to listen. So I want to actually give slightly personal and professional, outside of my governance role, point of view on this. So I'm a cognitive scientist, and I focus on human language. And so my academic career has been devoted to trying to understand how we use language to communicate and the underlying mechanisms that allow us to do that. And one thing that is widely recognized in the field is that communication between humans is grounded in the mental models that we individually have of the world and the mental models that we have of each other's mental models. Right? And actually, when those mental models are inadequately developed, especially the mental models of each other, communication is demonstrably less effective. And that's even in fully cooperative situations where you can assume that the interests that the person you're speaking to or listening to has pretty much the same goals in the conversation as you do. And it's even that much more complicated when when it's not a fully cooperative situation. And of course, speaking to the polarization that Daniel brought up, not all communicative situations are fully cooperative at this day. They never have been, but I think it's particularly tough right now. And so, so listening, I think, and perspective taking is just incredibly important as a routine activity for all of us, and especially if you are supposed to represent nearly 1,100 faculty in many different disciplines, from many different backgrounds, from many different countries. That's a massive job. There's no way that I'm going to complete that job in a 2-year term, but we can hopefully make some headway. And I also think that a core goal and priority for the chair of the faculty and for the faculty officers is to promote that kind of activity, that kind of listening, that kind of perspective taking. And so my goal is to promote that, and of course one way of doing so, I've learned a lot by trying to do that over the last years, things that I never understood, that I feel now at least I recognize I don't fully understand. And I think another aspect of that is, of course, posing questions. Based on what you hear, based on where you realize there's divergence between the ways that people are approaching things, posing a question that actually facilitates perspective taking, dialogue, sharing, airing of differences in a civil and collegial manner.
Thanks. Any comment on the faculty chair's role?
Well, I'll just add one story about this mental models, which I love this idea about that we're all working with these mental models of how other people perceive the world. And I would say as an associate chair, you get a lot of aggressive people who are maybe trying to pick a fight with you or maybe not. I'm not sure. And I think recently there was a faculty meeting where there was a report that was given out, and as part of that report, they said, there has been a real decline in civility on campus, and we are not having the kinds of dialogues that we should. We are not treating each other with the respect that we should. And you look around the room, and everybody's kind of like, oh yeah, that's true, that's true. And then one of the faculty members stood up and said, I think it is completely irresponsible for the committee to make this claim without any evidence. Like, I don't see how you could this is not part of your charge. Why would you say that there is a lack of civility on campus? And this is somebody who I had many run-ins with in the past, and when I heard that, it clicked. That shifted my mental model. I'm like, oh, he's not fighting with me. This is the way he has dialogues. I'm like, we've been in a constructive interaction this whole time, and I didn't even realize it. So now it's perfectly fine. Like now I understand. My mental model has now been adjusted, so I can actually have a constructive conversation with this person, and I understand kind of where we are meeting. So I think this Roger's point about getting better at understanding what our colleagues' mental models are can be very helpful in this space.
Thanks. I'm going to draw in Daniel. You've been president of MIT's Hillel organization. And so I put forward to you one of the tough questions, right? Do you think the MIT faculty has responded to the Gaza war reasonably?
So I feel like I certainly drew the short straw on that question. Well, first of all, I will say that I believe the MIT faculty to be generally level-headed and reasonable people. And in almost all the discussions that I've had about the Gaza war with my colleagues, I find people to hold very reasonable and generally well-informed points of view. They recognize the horror of what happened on October the 7th and the trauma that was inflicted on Israel. They recognize, I think, many of them feel that they recognize the need for a military response and for a defeat of Hamas, and at the same time, they feel deeply concerned about the extent of the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, which has just been worsening over the last few years. I think, unfortunately, as a corporate body, the faculty, let's say, don't express the wisdom of the individuals. I think one thing that needs to be understood with respect to October the 7th is that in many respects, the reactions to October the 7th were not really a reaction to October the 7th. October the 7th was the pretext, and there were long-standing undercurrents that basically came to the surface. And in the case of MIT, there was particular groups, I think, who had a long-standing antipathy to Israel and to Zionism. And that became expressed immediately after October the 7th, notably by student groups on October the 8th, with a letter that came out from multiple student groups attributing blame entirely to Israel for what happened the day before. And this was before there'd been any kind of response at all. And there was a faculty group, I believe mostly well-intentioned, who took up essentially what they felt, I think, was the noble cause of defending students who were accused of time and place violations, of essentially disruptive behavior, and became essentially an opposition to the administration. And my own sense is that this was extremely counterproductive. It polarized the faculty, it created an enormous amount of ill will on campus, it put the administration in a very difficult position, and I don't think it actually led to much constructive debate. That same group also commandeered the faculty newsletter, essentially as a kind of soapbox for their own political opinions, and I think that was a pity, not only because it rankled a lot of faculty who disagreed with them, but also because it essentially removed what might have otherwise been a forum for debate about very difficult questions that in the end became much more one-sided. So that's in short what I think happened with the faculty reaction. I think in a sense we're still recovering from some of the ill will that resulted from the sort of firing of accusations from all sides over this, and I think it's we will be sort of learning the lessons of that for a long time to come, and I'm hoping that we'll be able to fall back on our personal relationships, which are generally very good, and on the level-headed views of most faculty to try and bring us together in a more constructive kind of and the civil debate that Peko and Roger were talking about, which I think is really essential going forward.
I think the faculty meeting, the institute faculty meeting, betrayed a very strong polarization in the year following October 7th. This was very understandable in the sense that there were Israeli faculty who have families in the midst of the crisis, and there were others who had a very strong reaction to the many deaths that were taking place of Palestinians, and so I was troubled though by the fact that it seemed as though the extremes of the opinions dominated what was expressed in the institute faculty meetings. And more so than, in a certain sense, the more silent center, which was the people that you were referring to as people that had measured views of the situation. Do you think that's approximately right? Was that your impression?
I think there's some truth in that. I mean, I think that people who express extreme points of view tend to provoke each other, and that's a very unfortunate dynamic. And I think also there was a sort of sense of wanting to win, essentially, in the faculty meetings, which is not constructive because everybody loses in some sense when one side wins. I will say that I think that the Israeli faculty are in a particularly unfortunate position because they were, in some respects, directly felt under attack from some of the protesters. The calls, for example, to death to the IDF is perceived by Israelis who've been required to do their national service as a direct threat to them personally. And I don't think there's a full appreciation of the extent to which that threat is felt, and also to the extent to which the Jewish community in general feels deeply embedded with the Israeli community. And I would say this is not at all to say that the result of this should be that one should have unequivocal support of the Israeli government and its policies. And in fact, to me, I think one of the failures to understand the situation is that the rejection of Israeli faculty and the marginalization of Israeli faculty and postdocs and students and so on. I think if American postdocs abroad were treated like that, on account of the actions of the Trump administration, that would be regarded as wholly unacceptable. And yet it somehow has become acceptable for Israelis to be treated as representatives of of the policies of a government that most of them did not vote for.
Yeah, thanks. Roger.
Yeah, I just want to add a couple of remarks. First of all, thank you, Daniel, for taking on the short straw, at least to start. And I'm happy to throw in my own contributions on this topic as well, which of course is, this didn't happen during my term. It didn't start during my term, but it's certainly, the repercussions are certainly not over. The conflict is not over. One thing I think it's useful to keep in mind is that this is, of course, it's probably going to be no surprise for you to hear me say that this is in some ways a uniquely difficult, perhaps the most difficult sort of specific, not topic, but specific geopolitically localized series of events, long-term conflict for U.S. academia of any such case. It's so severe that maybe some of you know there's a book actually written by Kenneth Stern, who I think many of you, that name will be familiar, who's very involved in thinking about like how to characterize anti-Semitism and how to address it in college campuses. That itself is a topic of ongoing controversy. He has a book that he wrote called The Conflict Over the Conflict. I don't think there are many issues, many specific events. There are issues where people write about the issues, but specific topics like that, geopolitically specific topics where the consequences for university campuses are written about in their own right. So that's a good characterization of just how challenging it is. I also want to say, it's an interesting question to ask, when you think about the question, have the MIT faculty responded, there's, as I think Daniel brought up, there's an individualized way of thinking about that question. Have individual MIT faculty responded appropriately, and then collectively have we responded appropriately? And those are both complex. I think it's important to keep in mind that MIT has, once again, nearly 1,100 faculty, and on such an issue that was already polarized before the horrific events of October 7th, which, of course, once again, they're part of a longer history, but they're also uniquely horrible, and the aftermath, of course, is also tragic. I think by and large, you're not going to hear about a lot of the constructive and appropriate work that people have been doing quietly on campus as much as you're going to hear people from the extremes whose part of their communicative goals is actually to raise visibility of their own perspective. So I think it's important to keep that in mind when you look from the outside of the university and inside. I had my own personal experiences with long-term friends who heard about what was going on at MIT through their own personal networks in a way that was very discrepant from the facts on the ground. I think that's really important. And I also want to bring this back to seeing this unfold in the last nearly 2 years now at MIT, and also talking with colleagues on other campuses, has really reinforced to me and actually been a core reason why I've been thinking about the perspective taking and mental model development challenge and the need for us to do that. And I can speak personally, and as somebody growing up Jewish in America, something that actually took remarkably long in retrospect for me to become sensitized to is how the inadequacy of my own understanding of the subjective experience of Israeli academics who grew up in an entirely different context. I've had multiple Israeli mentees. I continue to have relationships with them. I've talked about these things with them. That has been a huge learning experience for me. And this is an issue where it is the case that principles of free expression and principles of a non-hostile environment they have come in tension. And it's important to understand how all the angles with which a particular message is understood by all parts of the community in order to actually find that balance. And this has been very challenging, I think. I mean, really, it's the administration, where they have to act. It's great to have a body like CAFC that has some distance. CAFC doesn't have responsibility for acting. CAFC can take a more deliberative point of view where they're not necessarily on a really, really tight timeline to make a response. It's hard, I think, for people who are on the front lines to make that fast response. So I just want to really it's such a difficult issue. So I wanted to just provide some more.
You want to say something quickly?
Yeah, just really quick. So I just wanted to second what Roger said, that, this comes again to social media and posting online, that the people who are posting online have an agenda, right? And so on all sides. And so from externally, if you're looking at what's posting online, it's important to ask, what is this person's agenda? Because it may not actually reflect what's going on campus. So I think we all have to get better at understanding how to read those signals.
Okay, I want to push the conversation in a different direction, and I'll let you speak, Peko, on what more should MIT be doing to promote free expression?
Yeah. So okay. So I actually have sort of the list of what has been done and what has not been done in the recommendations from the Fugue report. As everybody in this room knows, the faculty did adopt the Statement on Academic Freedom and Free Expression, which I think was really important. And I think maybe even more than the adoption, the debate was really important. Because we spent, people were sick and tired of this debate by the end of it, but we spent months actually going back and forth on every word of that document. And I think that exercise of having us talk to each other in a way that was going to be impactful, like we had to sign off on this at the end, was important. I know, Ian, you were in the midst of that. Right? It was instrumental in getting us to where we needed to go. One of the things that's ongoing is, Sally had asked CAFC to make recommendations on where our policies and procedures abut free speech and free expression. So one of the things we did is we did assess a number of these policies, and CAFC will post our recommendations online. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done in that space. But I think one thing that the administration could do that would be helpful is to be more sort of transparent or public about when they adopt the CAFC recommendations and when they do not, and if they do not, why. Right, I think that's part of an important dialogue, because right now a lot of the recommendations kind of go out into the void, and we have tried to be, again, open and transparent by posting those online, and you can take our recommendations and compare them against policies to see whether they've been adopted, but there's not a lot of transparency on the side of the people who have to implement those policies. We've created a website around free expression, which was one of the recommendations. I think, from my point of view, the most urgent thing is, again, having a dialogue with the community about the difference between online expression and in-person expression, because I think there's not a consensus about what is acceptable in that space. The other thing that I'll highlight, which was in the Fugue recommendations, was to do some sort of, was integrate training around free expression, about civil discourse, into both our curriculum and to other programming. While we did not look at that, there is currently a task force on the undergraduate academic program. I think they are going to be coming out with some recommendations soon, and I am hopeful that there may actually be some things in that report that that will move some of this in a really good direction. So, I think I would encourage you all to read that report when it comes out. The committee is TFUAP, TFUAP.
Okay, thanks very much. In a certain sense, we've got three, let's say, representatives, bodies that are addressing this question of free expression and academic freedom. We have MFSA, the alumni, which represents a strong alumni presence about particularly free speech. We have the MIT Council on Academic Freedom, which is basically volunteer faculty members, including lecturers and emeriti, who want to help promote open dialogue, civil discourse, and so on and so forth. And then we have also perhaps an ongoing, formally constituted committee or whatever it might be. We're not quite sure what the follow-on to CAFC is. And so I want to ask all three members in the long run, but I'll begin with Daniel. What do you think should be the roles in promoting free speech and academic freedom for those three different, or maybe just pick a couple of them, bodies? So maybe this is advice to MFSA as well as thinking about what the roles of the other two can be.
Wow. Well, first of all, I should say I'm not sure I have deep enough knowledge of those organizations to say much that's
Sure.
intelligent. I think the first thing I would say is that I think that MFSA and MITCAF can play a very useful role in basically encouraging expression of free speech and diverse points of view, maybe in convening meetings, and convening discussions about difficult issues and showing that it's possible to disagree about important topics in a civil way. I think that CAFC and its successors have played an incredibly valuable role in trying to sort of delineate these questions of free speech on campus. And I will say, I think one issue that I think would be very interesting to, maybe this is a bit of a third rail that they don't want to go near, but I think one issue that keeps coming up, but I don't believe we've really embraced, is the distinction that President Kornbluth makes between what one can say and what one should say. And I think that's extremely difficult because, of course, the very foundational notion of free speech is that if you can say it, then in some sense someone should say it, or we should certainly defend people's rights to say it. But on the other hand, we know that we are not just a random collection of individuals protected by the First Amendment, but we are also a community. And the question of how we build that community and what norms we put in place for that community, I think, are very tricky. So I find some of those examples very interesting and provocative about how we can delineate those kinds of issues. And I think going forward, we're going to need to do more of that if we're going to somehow roll back the polarization and our inability to talk to each other. And I think the kind of initiatives that Roger's been talking about, I think, are extremely valuable in that respect.
Yeah, I think you've hit on a very important point, and that is, and it's been mentioned earlier, and that is that in many respects it's the culture that needs to change and needs to guide both academic freedom and academic responsibility, which, in my opinion, can't be really separated. You can't really have academic freedom unless you have academic responsibility. Any other comments on the roles of these different bodies from others?
Sure. I'll say just a couple of things. So one is I actually want to just briefly note, I think it's actually important. So CAFC stands for Council on Academic Freedom and Campus Expression. So expression is sort of within free expression. I actually think it's important to distinguish academic freedom and free expression. And there's a very large body of what you might call sort of like informal and sometimes formal case law about free expression in the context of, say, U.S. governmental, like law and enforcement, judgments, and so forth. And I think one very important question to ask for every private institution outside of California, which has its own rules, but MIT included, is what's the relationship between what our policies are going to be and the First Amendment? Because the First Amendment, of course, is a very, we're not bound, MIT, by the First Amendment, but it sure is a natural starting point. And I think that's a really important ongoing discussion. And academic freedom is another thing, and I will say that having prepared for this role now, where there's no question academic freedom has to be in the forefront of my mind as chair of the faculty, the more I think about it, the more I realize that I don't fully understand the concept, or at least as thoroughly. I have more to learn, let's put it that way. And I think we all have more to learn on that. And so I just want to flag that as something, let's make sure that we keep those in mind as related but distinct concepts. In terms of free expression, I hope to see a big tent built around free expression, and I think this organization is extraordinarily important for that. CAFC is extraordinarily important, and MidCAF is one example of a self-organized group on campus of thoughtful and dedicated faculty who are willing to air different views, and it's been remarkable to witness, frankly, reading the way people engage, and I think that's a really, that's part of the kind of exercise in learning to do perspective taking that we need, and also developing norms about expression. So I hope to see that big tent continue to develop. That's an important kind of ongoing work, and to the extent that that big tent develops, it'll make the institution stronger and also set an example for higher education throughout the country and for all of civil society. The other thing I want to mention is that I actually think it's interesting to think about the relationship between these organizations and that model of shared governance within a university that I talked about before. So, once again, the administration is responsible for implementing, and in some sense, it gets two sources of guidance. The administration is what does, and it gets guided by, or can be guided by, if the situation is right, and I think it is at MIT, by faculty, by official faculty mechanisms. And CAFC has played an extraordinarily important role that way, and we're probably going to need something like that going forward. But that official sort of, once again, you're not on the ground on the front lines, but you're dedicated and you're engaged. And then the other source of sort of keeping the administration tethered to the principles and goals for the institution is, formally it's the corporation, but more broadly speaking, the corporation has, in a sense, a lot of it is representatives of alumni. And so I think it's useful to think about that as another kind of official body. And so strong governance within all of these organizations, together with self-organized bodies like MFSA and MITCAF, I think is just incredibly important in the overall landscape of guiding the institution to continually strengthening our community, building the right norms, and taking the right actions.
It's always seemed to me that shared governance is a tricky problem, okay? And it's a tricky concept. And of course, MFSA has essentially no role in the shared governance. It has only influence, not governance. And I think that I and a lot of faculty also feel rather strongly that we don't really have much governance, but we might have some influence. And so I think it's important to understand the issue of influence. Influence on the administration is something that I think many faculty feel rather distant from. Maybe you, as a faculty chair or a co-chair, feel you do have influence, but I think many faculty don't feel they have much influence on the administration. What do you think?
So I was going to answer the previous question, but this is a more interesting one.
Very interesting question.
So, I think that individual faculty are probably not going to have much influence, but when the faculty as a whole move together, there's a lot of influence. It's very hard to move against them. And so I think the role of the chair is to understand where is the center of mass of the faculty, and you can present that to the administration, right? That is very hard to push back on. I think if there are individuals that come in with particular viewpoints, yes, they're sampling the space, but that's probably not going to move policy.
I've got one final question that I'm going to put to the whole panel, and that is this. And they haven't heard this one. We heard before about 4, let's say, influence groups in the universities, and there was something missing. We heard about the upper administration, we heard about the trustees, we heard about the faculty, we heard about the students. Well, what was not mentioned was the staff. Actually, the staff are the second most large body in our university, and they have, in my opinion, enormous influence. It's subtle influence, and the question is, what should we do to improve or mitigate actions by the staff that what I would call, in a certain sense, in a prejudicial way, the bureaucracy, okay, so that it takes on board a move away from the kinds of cancel culture that we've tended to see in the past towards one more devoted to free expression. Anyone want to jump in?
Okay, I'll jump.
Go ahead.
I'll jump. So I'll say two things. One, so this is a little bit broader than just staff. I think this also comes back to the previous question we asked about what can these different groups do. I think one of the most important things that sort of a body can do is help to ensure visible consistency in the way we apply rules and the way we apply norms. Right? I think this is when we get ourselves into trouble is when there's no there's no visible response if something goes awry, or if somebody thinks there's something wrong and there is a response, but it's nothing, right? If it's actually, that's fine, that was not a violation of freedom of expression. So I think making all of that visible so people can assess, yes, the norms are being consistently applied across staff, faculty, and students, I think that helps. I think the other thing that, which is a little bit tangential, but I saw a lot of these issues, again, wearing my associate chair of the faculty CAPSI hat, for both, staff, students, and faculty alike. People tend to equate free expression with issues that really don't have anything to do with free expression, right? In the sense of, like, for example, if you break into my kitchen, and I don't want you in my kitchen, I'm going to call the police on you. If you break into my kitchen and start shouting your opinions at me, you have still broken into my kitchen. This is not a freedom of expression issue. This is an issue that you broke into my kitchen, right? And so I think there were issues like that we would deal with. Like, somebody might be in a job which is very forward-facing. So a lot of, like, all of our visitors to campus come from them, and they are wearing something that expresses a strong polarizing political viewpoint, right? And they say, I get to wear this because of freedom of expression. You say, well, your job is to welcome everybody to campus. So this is not an issue about freedom of expression. This is an issue about whether you are performing your job, to the best of your ability, right? So, and there were, I would say, probably more than half of the complaints that came to us were couched as freedom of expression, but they were actually just violations of other policies.
Yeah.
So I
thanks for
think understanding that is I think that will help in that
Thanks
space.
for that.
Yeah.
Do you think there was misunderstanding amongst the staff that were handling it, as well as the students or whoever were coming?
Everybody. Misunderstanding. Every faculty, staff, students. Yeah.
Okay. I think the reason I raised that question was because I think there's a great suspicion, and probably shared by many members of MFSA, that even though there is some visible relabeling of the roles of staff at MIT and in other universities, there isn't a purging. There's a retention of people who have shown what their opinions, or at least what they've perceived their jobs to be. And I'm wondering whether there's more that should be done to encourage the senior leadership to be willing to let people go.
Well, also, I'm not sure this is a freedom of expression. I think we're going to have to make a whole bunch of budget cuts, so people are going to be let go. I'm not sure that's again, maybe not a freedom of expression.
You want to say something, Daniel?
Well, I don't want to say anything on that particular question, but I do want to say that one thing that strikes me has happened, over the last 50 years or whatever, is that the traditional role of the faculty in the university has been shrunk. I don't remember when it was, but I remember one of my colleagues inveighing at a faculty meeting when on our faculty cards, we were demoted from faculty to employee. And I think it was actually a very significant change in terminology. It was Patrick Winston, exactly. Thank you, Yossi. And I think Patrick was right. And I think that maybe this is just, hankering for the good old days, and maybe this comes with a certain bias as a faculty member. But I think there was an understanding that feeding faculty into the upper echelons of administration was a good thing. And I wonder if we've allowed the bureaucratic side of the university to become too independent of the faculty. Yeah. And it would be better to try and infuse faculty members into senior roles who would be accountable to the faculty as a whole and would set the tenor of those administrative organizations more directly.
In the interests of having a good question and answer time from the floor, from the body of the audience, I want to cut things off there and invite you to ask questions. And my rule is this: it has to have a question that you can express in 30 seconds or less, okay? So that's my rule. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, Steve Carhart, MFSA board. From viewing faculty meetings and faculty newsletter and faculty leadership, my impression is that that STEM faculty has not been exercising much leadership around the culture of the community. My question is, and it has been heavily influenced by folks from SHAS who I think tend to indulge views around cancel culture and identity politics, things like that. Does your presence here suggest that STEM faculty are moving forward and assuming more responsibility around the culture of the Institute?
Thank you.
I mean, just very briefly, I actually think that if you go back and actually do the numbers on, say, faculty governance or committee, faculty elected committee representation, it's actually pretty well distributed. And the other thing I would say is that, I mean, like on the ground facts are that the SHAS faculty are not monolithic at all in their views or either across departments or within departments. So I actually think that's an oversimplification to characterize it that way. I also think that that STEM faculty have always played a leadership role in these issues at MIT, and I think that continues. You know, I'm a STEM faculty. Peko is STEM faculty. So I actually think the numbers are consistently be pretty good. Yeah. So yeah, I think I'm not sure that I would say that. I'd want to like look at the data. Let's take a look at the evidence. You know, in that regard.
What about the faculty newsletter, which is dominated by SHAS?
Well, yes, and also a well-known biology professor. So
I hope it doesn't.
it's not just. Yeah, sorry.
I know I shouldn't be just. I actually agree with you very much on your sentiments.
Well, I'll just say one thing. I do think our platforms favor the SHAS faculty. Like, it's STEM faculty, we're introverts and we don't want to stand up at the faculty.
That's my point.
Right, so exactly. So I do think platforms like faculty newsletter and the faculty meeting, that's an expression that some faculty are more comfortable with. And so, you know, one of the things that we set up in the last year, which is now dormant but needs to be revived, is the Pulse of the Faculty, where we thought, okay, what is something where people can easily, quickly give us their opinion? It doesn't take too much time out of their day. It's something where they feel comfortable expressing. They don't have to be you don't have to be a verbal person to weigh in. And so I think thinking about platforms like that, where people who are comfortable with different types of expression, I think that can only be helpful.
Okay, let's have a different question. Yes.
This is a brain science question. Is speech violence? Who believes that? What sort of brains? I mean, you have the SASH schools down the road, Leslie and the other one on Harvard, and they had a very different reaction than we have here. And I'd like to think that those of us who are on the spectrum and do STEM, sort of the same people, would think differently about the distinction between speech and violence. Or maybe it's not their brain, maybe just politics. It's a brain thing.
So what's the question? Is speech violence? Is that the question?
Who believes that?
Who believes that?
And why?
That's really interesting, actually. So first of all, obviously, speech and violence are different things, right? That's completely, there's no question about that. I think the more interesting question, well, there's two interesting questions. So what is it that people are trying to achieve when they say speech can be violence or speech is violence? What are the people trying to achieve? And then there's the brain science question, which is, of course, what different kinds of speech are different, right? Now, and that, please indulge me for a few seconds while I actually get into the science of this. So I actually have a dear friend and colleague at my former institution, UC San Diego, who actually wrote a book called What the F, which was actually dedicated to the study of taboo language. And there's a rich neuroscience literature on this, you know, it's fascinating. For example, there's cross-cultural variation. In general, there are sort of four categories of taboo words. There's what sort of slurs on groups. There's scatological language. There's language involving sexual activities, and then there's language involving divinity. And there's actually interesting cross-cultural variation in terms of which parts of those sets of four are actually sort of more taboo versus less taboo. So for example, in French, like divinity-related language is much more taboo than it is in the United States, in English. So there's a lot of really interesting science there. And there's also a lot of science like that some kinds of language activate you in a visceral way, right? And I think that is true. That doesn't mean that it's violence, but it also means that it's not the same as speech that doesn't have that characteristic. And bringing back to the perspective-taking thing, like what activates you in a visceral way may depend from individual to individual, from group to group. I have no doubt that that is behind some of the difficulty of managing what's been happening in the last 2 years, for example, is that people making decisions actually don't fully appreciate how language is taken by other groups. And not just language, other kinds of symbols as well, right? This is broader than just language. It's about symbolic activity by humans.
Daniel, did you have?
Sorry, I'm saying. Sorry,
I'm
I
cutting
should stop.
you off.
I'm sorry. Bring me into the science world.
You're too long. Okay.
Sorry.
Did you have a comment you wanted to make?
I'm not sure I have anything intelligent to say, except I think that a speech as violence is kind of a political slogan, and that's extremely problematic. I don't think it's actually grounded in any reality. It's normally grounded in suppressing certain kinds of speech. I do think, as the Metcalfe debates over the Charlie Kirk letter, exposed, there are some very deep concerns about what kinds of speech might be seen as incitement of violence. And I think that's also a very big problem that we're going to have to deal with. It also came up, for example, in the difficult case that I believe CAFSI had to look at of the Written Revolution, which was a student zine, which published some provocative opinions, but also associated a PFLP logo with an MIT-sponsored student organization. And that raised quite difficult questions about what it means to have free speech and to potentially be inciting violence.
Okay, I can give my answer in just very few words. Of course not, but some speech does harm. On to the next question. Yes.
Just a quick follow-up on that point, and since you touched on the neurological reaction, might there be also the issue that the neurological reaction has been created by the cultural shift created by the left? In other words, in the 60s, the N-word was fine, and people used it, and probably name a bunch of politicians who had no problem using it. Today, you say the God forbid N-word, and it almost provokes a visceral reaction. I've seen that in kids and students and all that, right? So I think that might go to your point that neurological reaction is created in part by the cultural shift.
Okay. I don't think there was a question there, but maybe there's one there. Anyone? Well, let me say, first of all, I'm not sure that the purpose of free speech is to change the society. I think the purpose of free speech in the academy is to seek truth and to disseminate it. And so I would slightly challenge the premise of your question. But I do think that there is something about the students that we need to help them in many ways embrace freedom of expression and in a certain sense move away from this immediate reaction of taking offense, which is also a very, common process and is modeled for students and often by students. So that would be my answer. Any other questions? Yes.
Both the gentleman behind me and Peko alluded to the imbalance in influence between humanities professors and STEM professors. I hope I'm not misstating. My question is, what are the, how many MIT faculty are on soft money, and does the requirements or the need to get grants contribute to this imbalance? That is to say, STEM faculty with big research budgets and costly science have to spend all our time seeking money, whereas those people who have guaranteed salaries may not, and may have a lot more time on their hands.
Thank you for that question. I'll answer it quickly, if you don't mind. All faculty, all tenure track and tenured faculty are on hard money at MIT almost universally, and that is not, generally speaking, a personal issue for them, but it is the case that STEM faculty, engineering and science particularly, tend to have much larger groups and much larger costs involved with their research. And that is, in a certain sense, more of a distraction. And I think that's one reason why faculty in humanities and other disciplines tend to be more willing to take on roles in faculty administration. I don't think it's actually the case that we have, for example, proportional representation of the different schools of MIT at on the committees and so forth. It's simply not the case that we have proportional representation, because of course we've got mostly engineering faculty, and we want to have some representation from the other schools as well. So I think that's basically the answer to the question. Yes?
It's a Senate, not the House. Yeah.
Oh, thanks so much for this thoughtful discussion. With free speech, we need to focus on the speaker, but I think it's just as important and often overlooked to focus on the hearer. Hearer has a right not to listen, of course, but also it seems to me a responsibility to become strong and self-confident so that they're not easily offended or threatened for successful free speech community. If people are easily threatened or offended, every spoken word may be a threat, but if they're self-confident, free speech blossoms. So might a course or workshop in building self-confidence be part of our free speech training? In my 20s, I took the Dale Carnegie course, which builds habits and self-confidence and positive thinking, which has been tremendously helpful for me. And I wonder if that might be an example.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, and I think the task force on the undergraduate academic program is thinking about a lot of interesting things in that space, and I think they're at a time when they're going to want to hear back from the community. So I think if you, as alums, have ideas in that space, I would definitely reach out to them.
Yeah, I would completely agree. I think that, and I think that Daniel used the word resilience, in some of his writings, and I think that yes, we want to build that into education. And I think it's, that's actually already there to some extent, but I think formalizing it, codifying it, making it a goal in and of itself, I think is a great idea.
I just got a signal we got 3 minutes left, so there's one last, is there one last question? Yes, Frank, you've been trying hard all the way through.
The tension between freedom of expression in research and books and publications versus when does it end at MIT or at academia, when it goes into advocacy, perhaps indoctrination and teaching, or in campus tours for new parents or something like that. Can you comment on that tension?
Sorry, just say the question again.
Is there unlimited freedom of expression from anybody teaching a course when they choose to take that towards advocacy?
Well, just from a systems point of view, there are departments of education committees that review courses that are going to be taught. That's maybe a short version of the question. So there's considerable latitude in the interest of advancing scholarship and the forefront of knowledge and communicating that, but people are not individual, unrestricted free agents in that rate, even as tenured faculty, say, at an institution like MIT.
Yeah, and I think those committees, they tend to make the decision based on expertise. Like, are you a qualified scholar in this area, versus, versus, I don't think they're judging whether it's advocacy or not, typically in those assessments.
Okay, let's wrap up. I want to thank our panel very much for engaging in tough questions and giving us your viewpoint. So let's thank the panel.